Welcome to You Can't Break Us, the podcast sharing real stories of parental alienation and family court injustice. I'm your host, Kaylin Hawkinson. Each episode, I sit down with brave guests who open up about their personal journeys, the pain, the resilience, and the fight for justice. These stories are raw, real, and powerful because speaking out is how we break the silence and remind the world, you can't break us. Hi, Kevin. Thank you for being here today. I'm happy to share your story on here. It's a different perspective of a child actually growing up being alienated.
Yes.
And so could you maybe start us off as a child's perspective, growing up through that, how it felt and where the alienation began?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me on. I'm humbled to be on here, and hopefully this story can provide some healing and some clarity for either adult survivors of this who went through this as children or parents who either are going through it or have gone through it. So for me, this entire story takes place in Missouri. Some of it takes place in Kansas City. Some of it takes place right smack in the middle of the state in Columbia, Missouri, and some of it takes place in St. Louis, Missouri. But growing up, my earliest memories that I have from childhood are with my dad, and they are all good. My father and I were very, 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 very close when I was growing up. We had a very, very, very close bond. He was kind of my primary caretaker growing up. He was sort of a entrepreneur, real estate up and comer in the Kansas City area. So his schedule was very free. And so he was home a lot of the time. So he was the one who, a lot of those first steps that I took, he taught me how to walk, he taught me how to talk, he put books in my
Wow.
hands. We
Mhm.
had a shiny blue bike that he used to put me in, and he would bike me around Kansas City. He took me to the zoo. He took me to all these museums, all of these parks. We were very, 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 very close. Um, my mother was a very, very complicated woman. And one of the things that I always like to say when I tell this story is that in the narratives of our lives, there are no heroes and there are no villains. There are only people who do things, and people do things for a wide variety of very complex reasons. So, as easy as it can be to cast people in the role of hero or villain, that's black and white thinking, and that's not healthy. I don't do that.
Okay.
That's actually something that people that have been alienated sometimes struggle with as a result of that black and white thinking. And in my healing, I've become a lot more nuanced about this. So, my mother was a very, very complex woman, and what I now know that obviously as a kid I didn't know because I didn't have a framework for it is that she was mentally ill. She had a disorder called Munchausen's by proxy, and she was a nurse, so she worked in healthcare. And she believed that I was sick and that I had all of these different conditions when in fact I did not. And that was really where the conflict in the marriage between my mom and my dad started. My mother began to over medicate me and began to give me lots and lots and lots of medications that I did not need. And my father is a very, very intelligent man. He's very, very smart. He's very well read. And he realized pretty quickly what was going on. He tried to convince my mother to get help. There was a lot of conflict about that because my mother was very, very, I would say, overprotective, very, we got to shield him from everything. She thought there was all this mold in the air, so I couldn't go outside. There were all these germs. I was going to die if I went and played outside. And my dad is very much, kind of old school. Let him play around in the mud, let him eat a bug.
Yeah.
It's good for him, those kinds of things.
Hmm.
And what I do remember, and this is kind of where the trauma really started, is one day I woke up and my dad wasn't there. He
Hmm.
just wasn't there. And what I now know is that there was a lot of conflict in the marriage surrounding this. And what my mom would do is she would, whenever she and my dad would have a fight, she would leave. but she would take me with her. So she would grab me,
Oh,
she would go, and then she would go to Columbia, Missouri, which is about 2 hours away, and stay with her parents, my grandparents.
okay.
The other thing about all of this that is going to be important later on is that my mother was adopted. So these are
Okay.
her adopted parents that live in Columbia. And so that's an important part of the story, but we'll come back to that
Yeah.
a little bit later. And so pretty much from the point that I can remember that disconnect happening and waking up and my dad not being there. I remember going and sitting in little offices with people that I assume were counselors, social workers. There was a book that I remember. I think you can still buy it. I think it's on Amazon, but it's called Dinosaur's Divorce or the
Okay.
Dinosaur Divorce Book. And in that, I remember reading that with a either a counselor or a social worker and trying to make sense of what was happening here.
Yeah.
And pretty quickly, though, that was really when the I call it the brainwashing started from
Mm-hmm.
my mother. And what's interesting about it is that my earliest memories do not involve my mother telling me that my father was abusive. That would come later.
Mm-hmm.
My earliest memories, and it's a very specific memory, but I was asking to spend time with my dad, and the way I was saying it in my very little kid voice, I was about 4 years old when this happened.
Okay.
Um, but I said, I want to have longer visits with my dad. And my mother absolutely lost it with me. She started screaming at me and she said, if I allow that to happen, your father is going to kidnap you. He's going to come in the night and he's going to take you away. And she was really specific in describing he's going to come in the window, he's going to take you. Do
Wow.
you want that to happen? And I broke down. I was sobbing. I
Yeah.
was like, no, mom, no, 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 no. Like, don't let daddy take me. Don't let daddy take me. And
Yeah.
so when I was real worked up about this, finally she said, well, I'll call the Department of Family Services, the DFS, and we'll see what I can do about this. But I don't know if I'm going to be able. You said this. I don't know if I can take this back. And she called the DFS and she said, "This boy is afraid of his father. I think his father did something to him." And that
Oh.
was really where it started. So, um, I'm going to pause there. Do you have any questions, or is there anything I can add? That's when the alienations started.
Yeah. No, that's a good example to show, I think also parents who are going through it and maybe confused with how children react to them when they're loving and trying to fight to have time with their children. It can realistically get confusing from a parent's perspective of, what's going on? Why is my child acting this way or behaving this way? I mean, that's showing the background of how that other parent can kind of plant those ideas into the child's head, kind of twist it around, and then make you feel like, well, you did this, you said this, when
Yes.
she's kind of coaching that. I
Yeah,
think that shows a great example of that.
that's exactly right. And from there, the allegations just got more and more wild. Now, through all this, though, I did continue to have visitations with my dad. He did have those. So we
Okay.
would go to Kansas City and we would do all of the normal kinds of stuff. And then at a certain point in all of this, and the memories on this are kind of fuzzy, but my mother accused my father of molesting me.
Okay.
She said that he was a child molester, that he had molested me, that he had molested my little brother, even though there was zero evidence of this whatsoever. And
Yeah.
what I do remember is, again, being taken into a room, going in and talking to a social worker. They did play therapy with me. Again, I was between 4 and 5. And at one point, they pulled out like these dolls, and it's like, okay, we're gonna play house, and it starts out all normal, and then it's like, okay, now we're gonna take the clothes off and we want you to show us where daddy touched you. And so it's like, does daddy touch you here, like on the hand? Yeah, daddy touches me there. And then eventually they go
Hmm.
to the privates and they say, does daddy touch you there? And in my little kid way, I said, well, of course he does. But what I was trying to say is, when I go to the bathroom, okay, that's what I was
Hmm.
trying to say. He helps me go to the bathroom. But my mom took that and said, oh my gosh, so he's validated this. And so then she threw all of these things in front of him, trying to prevent him from seeing us. She demanded that the visits be supervised, all of these kinds of things. And what was interesting is that eventually we got a supervisor that came through the church that we were attending. And my mom kind of handpicked him. And this was really interesting because in my recovery, I actually went back and found this man. His name's Eric Miller. And I hadn't spoken to him since I was probably 9 years old. And I went and found him, and he filled in a lot of the gaps for me about what was happening. But basically, my mom had filled his head with all of these ideas about my dad before he had even met him. So
Yeah.
he was under the impression that my father was this really malicious, violent, alcoholic, pedophile of a person. And then he would go and he would supervise these visits and he would sit with my dad, and eventually he got to know him. And eventually, after 3 or 4 months of this, he really started to question a lot of what my mother was saying. At a certain point, he even had a conversation with my grandparents, my mom's parents, and they said, they didn't tell him everything, but they said, don't believe everything she tells you. Don't believe everything you hear. And then eventually, after like I think it was a year of supervising these visits, he went to the court and he said, I don't see any evidence that this man is malicious in any way. He seems to be a very involved, loving father. He doesn't seem to have a violent bone in his body. And so I don't think these visits need to be supervised. And from there, my dad got unsupervised visits. And that's where kind of the happy part of the story
Yeah.
takes over. That happened when I was about 6. So from the age of 6 to about 12, so you're talking 6 years,
Yeah.
I have some amazing memories with my dad that I treasure. He bought a plot of land about 20 minutes outside of Columbia, Missouri. So at this point, I'm living with my mom. My mom remarried my stepfather. We're living in Columbia, Missouri. And my dad bought a little plot of land about 20 minutes outside of Columbia because he wanted to build a house out there so that he could be closer to my brother and I.
Okay.
And so every other weekend he would get us for 30 days in the summer. And I have a lot of really good memories. We would go out to the land. He eventually built a cabin out there where we would stay. It was like a piece of heaven. I was never happier than when I was out there with my dad.
Oh,
And there was never anything malicious that happened out there whatsoever. My dad was more of the kind of give him freedom sort of parent. He didn't really helicopter at all. He kind of let me, run and scrape my knees, and he bought me a BB gun and taught me how to shoot it, and that kind of stuff. I used to spend a lot of time in the woods. I would flip over boards and rocks and find snakes and lizards and stuff like that. I had a dog that he got me that I would run through the woods with. It was just like that was my little piece of heaven. I absolutely loved that place. It was absolutely incredible. Now, I will say that in all of this, my dad was a very, very, very good dad, but my dad was not perfect, as no parent is.
right.
But what you have to understand is that throughout all of this, I'm going and I'm seeing my dad every other weekend, but then I'm coming home and my mom is telling me things about my dad that are very inconsistent with what I'm experiencing.
Yeah.
I could give you a running list of the things that she told me. So, one of the things that she would do is my dad liked to buy me things when I was with him. He would buy me little gifts and things like that. And my mom would always find a reason to take those away. She would say, "No, you can't have that." And at this point, my mom got like really religious. She got like almost Pentecostal, holy roller, speaking in tongues type religious. And so what she would say is, these things are ungodly. You can't have them. And eventually, she would say things about my dad that had a religious bend to them. She told me that my dad was literally possessed by the devil. She told me that. He was possessed by the devil. Again, I'm like 10 years old when she's telling me these kinds of
Yeah.
things. She told me that he was violently abusive when they were together, that at one point he had pulled a flaming log out of a fireplace and had beaten her with it. She told me that he had threatened her at gunpoint, that she had pets like dogs and cats that he had killed in like violent rages. Again, she repeated the child molester thing. And when I started questioning that, she changed the story. She said, "Well, he wasn't the one that did it, but he allowed it to happen. He was so negligent of you that one of his creepy, weird friends came over and molested you when you were a child. Things like that. She told me that he was an alcoholic. That was a big one. Um, there were other things too, but throughout all of this, again, my own experience with my dad was nothing like that. So it was almost like I became two people. There was a
Yeah.
splitting that happened where when I was with my dad, I was one way, and then when I would go home to be with my mother and my stepdad, I was another person. And it, what you have to understand, and I think that this is valuable for any parent
Mhm.
that is watching their child and the behaviors that they're exhibiting through a parental alienation dynamic, the child is going to act very inconsistently. I think it's a hallmark of it. It's almost like, you
Yeah.
can see it a mile away. If your kid is saying different things or even like is lying, or being dishonest about things, that can be, I think, a telltale sign that this is kind of going on.
Yeah.
Um so it really did a number on me. I mean, every time I had to leave my dad, it hurt. I remember that. It was like every single time that I had to leave him and he gave me that final hug and I had to go home, um to my mom and my stepfather, it hurt every single time.
Yeah.
And there was a really screwed up dynamic too that was going on with my mother and my stepfather, where my stepfather on his own, he's not a horrible person, but I think he's very gullible. He's very childlike in certain ways. I actually think he might be like autistic on the spectrum, maybe. But he always kind of went along with whatever my mom wanted to do, and they collectively would punish me for things that I did when I was with my dad. So if my dad took me to a movie that they did not approve of, remember they were really religious at that point, I
Yeah.
would be punished for that. And so I learned to be very secretive about what was happening when I was with my dad, almost like I have to keep this hidden. I have to be ashamed of this.
Yeah.
I can't share too much of this. I have to hide this in certain ways. And so that dynamic was going on the home front too. And as a kid, you don't understand this. All you know is that something just feels really wrong.
Yeah.
And that's all you know. So I'm going to pause there. Does all of this make sense? Is there anything else that I can
Yeah.
fill in the
I
gaps on?
Again, I think that's a great example of showing survival mode. Kids being in survival mode. Is that how you felt? It's survival, really, because you're being shown that you can't show that you're happy with your dad. You can't have a good time with your dad. You can't enjoy these things. These are wrong. And so you learn to adapt to what your mother is wanting from you. And then you have to act and behave or say certain things. And again, the testament to kind of being feeling like you're two different people. Here you're one person and here you have to be one way. And that sounds like survival mode in your mother's home as well.
Very much so. And the other piece to this too, and sometimes when we talk about parental alienation, and again, I think this is valuable information for any parent to know that's going through it. There are other people that have been roped into this delusion by this alienating parent.
Hmm.
And in my mother's case, her family, her adopted family, the family that I grew up with, that I love dearly, those are the Kings. And they're kind of all over the Midwest, but this was like I was so close to all of them growing up. My aunts, my uncles, my grandparents, I loved them dearly. And they actually never said a bad word about my dad directly to me, but it was kind of this we don't talk about Bruno type subject. Like, we don't
Yeah.
talk about Kevin's dad. And it was because, again, he had been kind of blacklisted as like the black sheep of the family. Like,
Hmm.
really bad guy. We just don't bring him up. And so when I was around them, even if I was having an amazing time and I felt like I couldn't really talk about him. I couldn't
Yeah.
really bring him up because of that, because it was just this kind of hands off subject. Now, I
Hmm.
will say that in my recovery, which we'll get to in a little bit, I went back and spoke to each one of them and said, look, I've got some things to share that it may come as very, very shocking to you, but this is the truth. I'm not lying. This is what happened. And I expected all of them to just like write it off as pure craziness, but every single one of them had the same response. It was like, well, we always kind of suspected something like that was going on, but we were never really sure, and we didn't really know what to call it, and so we just tried to kind of love you and not put you in the middle of things. And so
Yeah.
that made me feel good. I got a lot of affirmation out of that, and so
Yeah, good.
but there's other people that are kind of roped into this, is what I'm trying to say. So
Yeah.
now again, in all of this, my dad was a very, very, very good, very intentional father. But he was not perfect. He did have a few traits that the expression I like to use is that my mom had loaded the cannon. My mom had loaded the cannon with all of these ideas about my dad to make me afraid of him.
Yeah.
And so I looked for things. And I would say that I analyzed things closer than I really needed to. So while my father was not an alcoholic, I don't ever remember seeing my dad drunk once. My dad didn't. My dad is a beer drinker. My dad likes his beer, and he's a guy. He's an interesting guy because he's kind of equal parts uh, genius, scholar, Robinson Crusoe, and redneck. He's kind of equal parts all of that,
Yeah.
and he definitely likes to take off his shirt, work out in the sun, drink a beer, maybe drink two or three.
Yeah.
That's how he is. But it never affected me in any kind of a way where it was like I never felt in danger because of him.
Yeah.
Um, that would come back later. He also, and he still actually to this day kind of does this. It's almost like an OCD thing where I never saw him drink hard alcohol. I never saw him slam vodka or anything like that. It was always beer. It was
Hmm.
always cheap beer, but he would do this thing where he would like open a beer, take like a sip out of it, put it to the side, and then he would like forget it was there, and he'd be out working, and then like 2 hours later it would be skunked and hot, so we'd go open another one. So it would look like he'd put away, 15 beers over the course of a weekend, but in reality, you'd go around and you'd find all these beer cans with like one sip taken out of them, and that's just
Yeah.
what he did.
Hmm.
But as a kid, I looked at that and I went, well, maybe that's what mom's talking about. Maybe this is
Yeah.
what I need to be afraid of. I remember one time I was on visitation with him and he took me to Kansas City and he said, "Hey, look, I'm going to take you to this pub where they have really good chili dogs," because he knew I liked those. And we went in and I ordered a chili dog. He ordered a beer. We ate lunch together. There was nothing weird about it. But later on, kind of in thinking it through in my kid brain, I was like, oh, my dad just took me into a bar. And again, I'm growing up in this house that's really
Right.
religious. And so
Hmm.
that became sinister when there really wasn't anything sinister about it. It was pretty
Right.
normal stuff. Um, the breaking point though came, and I remember pretty much verbatim when it happened. This is actually a really hard time of year for me because if you study trauma, you know that there are trauma anniversaries that the body remembers and the mind remembers. And
Yeah.
for me, the moment that I lost my dad, and this was the big time alienation, that this was when that happened. It was October of 1996. I was 12 years old. And the reason that I remember that is because it coincides with my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. Their 50th wedding anniversary was October 12th, 1996. So, what had happened, and you have to go back to that summer. So, that summer, my little brother Kelly and I had been with our dad for 30 days in the summer. And during that time, um, there was a night when my brother had gotten a hold of a book of matches or a candle and was playing with them and had lit something on fire. And in that moment, it was actually down at the cabin on my dad's land. And in that moment, I saw my dad do something that I had never seen him do before. He grabbed my little brother and with an open hand, he hit him. Not in the face. It was very much, you would probably call it spanking, whatever. Um, now, I'm not saying that's right. Like, I have three kids and I don't use that kind of punishment with them. I don't think it's effective. But in looking back on it, it was the only time I ever saw it happen, And now, as an adult, I look back on that and I go, okay, even if now I don't think you should do that, I don't think that's an effective way to parent. It's not abuse. I wouldn't say that's abusive parenting. 5 minutes later, my brother was running around and like things were fine. But when I saw that, something in my brain went red alert, red alert, red alert, abuse, 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 abuse. And so I just kind of took it and sat on it and I got really, really, really quiet, and I didn't know what to do with it. And in October of 96, so this happens over the summer, and I don't say anything about it. October of 96, it's my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. And this is actually a detail I left out of other interviews that I've done, but this is an important piece of the puzzle. It was my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary, and they had scheduled this big celebration with all of my aunts and uncles on a weekend when it was my dad's weekend for visitation. And at a certain point, I called my dad up and we were talking, everything was fine. And then I said, "Hey dad, this is coming up. Can we move your weekend to next weekend? I really want to go to this." Now, I don't know if my mom orchestrated this so that it was like a last minute thing, or if my dad was just having a bad day, or if the Kings as a general rule were a sore subject for him. I don't know, but he got kind of ticked off. And he didn't yell at me, but he was like, "Oh, this is all a bunch of crap. They're trying to interfere with my visits again, this and that." And very quickly, it hit a pressure point with me. I ended up screaming at him. I said, "You're a liar. I never want to see you again." I hung up the phone and I was crying. I was really upset. And my mom kind of swooped in and was like, "Oh, what's wrong here?" And I was like, "I never want to see him again. I never want to see him again." And she's like, "Oh, I'll make sure that never happens again." And in that moment, she was like, "In fact, like I want you to, write letters to your dad and I want you to tell him how you feel." And I wrote these really hateful things and horrible things to him. And pretty quickly after that, in that moment, I'm very worked up. I'm very animated. In that moment, I was like, I want to tell you about what dad did. Dad hit Kelly. And then my mom, "Oh, tell me about this." And I described what had happened, and she was like, "That's not the whole story, is it, Kevin? You're telling me that he used an open hand, but he hit your brother with a fist, didn't he?" And I said, "Yeah, he used a fist." "Okay, now tell me the story again." And she did this for like weeks. She made me like redo the story. And eventually it got to a point where it was not my dad spanking my brother because my brother was playing with fire. It was my dad had thrown my brother down and was punching him in the back and had also hit me and had thrown me downstairs and almost broke my leg and all this other stuff. And when it finally got to the point where the story was crazy enough, my mom took me to a social worker, and I think there may have been a lawyer involved, and I accused my father of child abuse, which he was not guilty of. And that broke me. Now, what you have to understand, and what I now understand about all of this, is that I had been developing post traumatic stress disorder for a while because of all of this. I actually had it probably for over 30 years without knowing that that's what it actually was. I was having problems with memory. I was having problems with concentration. The avoidance behaviors that they talk about with PTSD, that was going on. I had a lot of stomach problems. By the time shortly after this, when my mom kind of took me away from my dad and there was all this court stuff involved, and I accused my father of child abuse and all these other things. I started to get really, really bad migraines. I had difficulty connecting with people. I got very isolated socially. And at this point, my mom actually took me and my brother. We moved to St. Louis, as far away from my dad as she could get us. And it was basically a cut communication there from the time I was 12, probably to the time I was 15. I didn't see my dad for like 3 years, didn't talk to him, nothing. And in that time period, my mom continued to really pour it on. Like the stories just got wilder and wilder and wilder. Eventually it got to the point where she was saying not only do all these things apply to your dad, but also like all of his brothers and sisters and his father, like all the family on that side, they're all that way. They're all pedophiles and they're all drunks and they're all, abusive and dysfunctional and all this stuff. None of which is true. Like none of this
Right.
is true. Um, but this is what she was doing.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna pause there because that's a lot. But
Yeah, no, I mean, I love hearing the perspective of a child growing up because most of these stories on here have been parents sharing their perspective.
yeah,
And so I do like to see how it feels as a child going through this and how they view it, how they see it, what they're kind of being taught or coached, and how that manipulates even good memories you had
yeah,
with your father because it made you start kind of really analyzing every little thing that's happening and just kind of not, being confused and not understanding then how did it feel? I know on the phone call when you were mad at your dad, was that just the heat of the moment and saying
yeah,
I don't want to see you again and
yeah.
then probably
And then
feeling bad?
my mom kind of took advantage of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
is what really kind of ended up happening. And what I do remember too is I ended up going to this anniversary celebration that my grandparents were having, but there was fear there. I was afraid that my dad was like going to walk in any moment, and all of a sudden, like this really close, affectionate bond that we had
Yeah.
was replaced by, oh, I'm afraid. Like I'm really afraid that he's like going to come in here and take me away and this and that. And now as an adult looking back on that, there's a lot I could say about that. There's been some really good work done on this as it relates to the attachment system
Hmm.
and a child's attachment system, and how if the children look to their parents for meaning. They don't independently create meaning. They look to their parents to create meaning. So
Yeah.
if one of the parents is signaling there's a threat, there's a threat, there's a threat, the child's avoidant system is going to come on and that fear response is going to kick on. So
Hmm.
that's what was happening. There wasn't an actual threat there. My dad wasn't going to hurt me, but
Right.
the signal was there. So that's kind of what was going on
Hmm.
at that point. And I really, I really started to suffer as a result of this.
Wow.
It got really, really bad. I was socially isolated. I had difficulty sleeping. I had nightmares, and this is an important piece of the puzzle too. When all of this happened, when that final break with my dad happened in October of '96, I lost memories.
Okay.
All of those good memories of my dad went away. I didn't have access to them. I could not remember any of that. It was just um, this dissociation from it almost. And what I now know is in PTSD they call that dissociative amnesia.
Okay.
And it for me it happened in two different ways. There was both a loss of all of those memories. I couldn't remember them, but even the pieces that I could kind of remember, I had no emotional connection to. I didn't feel anything about it. I might have known that, oh, your dad like bought you a dog, but I didn't have any emotional attachment to that. It just wasn't there. Um, and that caused a lot of problems. Again, there was memory loss, there was depression, there was anxiety. Eventually, as I entered into high school, I started to self harm. And I had no idea that any of this was related to what had happened with my dad, because what was going on is at this point, my mom was taking me to therapists, and I was just kind of repeating to the therapists every single thing that my mom had told me. I am depressed because my father is violently abusive. And then they would help me work through this trauma that hadn't actually happened.
Yeah.
And then it was almost like I was acting. It was like, okay, I'm all better now, and it would
Yeah.
last for a month. And then I would be right back to where I started. And then I would go see another one and the same thing would happen. So it was one of those things. No, none of these therapists ever stopped to like question that narrative. That none of them did. They just kind of accepted that, oh, okay, this must be what's going on. And it was really a lot of negligence, I think, on the part of counselors, because like the signs were all there. If somebody had just stopped to do a little bit of critical thinking, they would have figured it out. Now, eventually, there was a therapist that figured this out. Eventually, throughout all of this, my father never stopped fighting for me ever. He desperately wanted to be in my life. And eventually, um, there were court-ordered supervised visitations with a therapist in Kansas City. So this started when I was about between 15 and 16. Every other weekend, we would go up to Kansas City for these reunification therapy sessions. And and of course, like any alienated kid does, I hadn't seen my dad in almost 3 years. There were all these stories that I had been fed. I was just repeating the narrative. I fought this with everything that I had. I fought this with every single thing that I had. And eventually, but in these therapy sessions, there were like little breakthroughs that would happen. There were little breakthroughs. And eventually, after the therapist's name is, I think it's Greg Sisk. He's in Kansas City. He operates a practice there. And eventually, he went before the court and he told them these kids have been brainwashed. That's literally what he said. He said these kids have been brainwashed. He said, they preach this narrative about abuse, but if I get them alone, especially this one Kevin, if I get him alone and I really start to pry, he can't really give me specifics about abuse, but if I start to ask about good memories, he can give me really specific things if I start to just gently kind of pry. And so in those therapy sessions, there were some that actually went fairly well. My dad was doing little things to kind of trigger the good memories. I remember at one point, like it was like our second or third session, we went in there and he was like, it's been a while since I've seen you on a birthday. Let me give you something. Let me make up for it. And he gave me like $100 and he was like, don't give this to your mom. Like, go get something really good for yourself. And immediately I was like, oh, this is amazing. I love this. And it wasn't a bribe. It wasn't that. But what was happening there is that was triggering in my brain. Oh, my dad used to buy me gifts. Okay.
Yeah.
But what did my mom do with that? So my mom had a team of 3 lawyers working for her, none of whom spent any more than 5 minutes with me. And she went to them and it turned into, oh, the father is bribing them. That's what's happening here. It's just, forgive my language, but it's just such holy bullshit. It's ridiculous. Um, and it was, looking back on it, it was really, really sad because what would happen is that in some of these sessions, I would start to bond with my dad. My
Mhm.
mom would sense that. I'd go back home and then just the stories, the stories, the stories, the stories, survival mode, survival mode. I'm depressed. I'm self-harming. I'm anxious. All of this stuff is going on. I don't know what to do. It was a really, really hard time. It's kind of amazing that I made it out of there alive, to tell you the truth. By the time I was 17, I was probably pretty close to being suicidal. It was really, really bad. And eventually, though, something really interesting happened, and this was where the story started to turn. When I was 17 years old, my stepfather got offered a job in New Mexico. So we're living in St. Louis at this point, and he got offered a job in New Mexico. And my parents gave me the choice. They gave me the choice to go with them or stay in St. Louis to finish my senior year of high school. And I chose to stay back. I stayed in St. Louis. And my dad at this point kind of said, like, I remember him saying this. He said, Kevin, you're going to be a man soon. You're going to be 18. You're going to be able to make your own decisions. I'm not going to force you to see me if you don't want to. Because I was coming into these sessions with cuts all over my arms. I mean, it was really obvious that things were really bad. And I remember my dad saying this and just crying. And he said, if you don't want to see me, I'll bow out. Well, I'll come find you later, but we don't need to do this now. And it was actually kind of an act of mercy on his point. And so that's what he did. He kind of backed off. The visitations stopped. And for that 1 year in St. Louis, I lived with a family, a very good family, that were going to our church. And they kind of sort of nursed me back to health. I didn't talk about my dad. I didn't talk about anything that had happened. But I did go to a counselor that started to test me for like stress and um and started to see this post trauma, but she was smart enough to say, I can't say why this is happening. I don't know. I wasn't there. All I know is that it's there and it's linked to something, but I can't say why. It's just it's there. And she was really good to me. So for that senior year, I lived with this family. I started to kind of come out of my shell. My friendships grew. I was still sort of a mess in certain ways, but things started to get better. And then at the end of my senior year, I had a full ride scholarship to go to a university in Chicago. And this is gets really interesting because your subconscious is going to come out somehow. Like it's going to impact you.
Right.
And at
Mm-hmm.
the last minute, I turned it down and I said, I don't think I want to go to Chicago. I think I want to go to the University of Missouri in Columbia, where
Okay.
all this started.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. I remember, and I called my parents up, my mom, my stepdad. There was this giant blow up over it. I mean, they were steadfastly against it. It was like, if you do that, you are on your own. We're not supporting you. We're not giving you a dime. You are on your own. And I said, fine. And
Wow.
I ended up. It was really interesting. I lived with my grandmother. She was elderly by this point. My grandfather had died, and I kind of lived with her and helped her around the house and things like that. I went to classes at Mizzou. And I remember rolling up into town. I applied to classes like 2 days before the semester started,
Oh, wow.
and got in and was making it work. But after I had everything figured out, it was crazy. The first place where I went was back to the land.
Oh,
I
wow.
just went. And I
Mm-hmm.
had no idea why I was doing it. In my head, this was still this hellhole where my father had violently abused me, but I kept going back there. And it
Mm-hmm.
was 20 minutes outside of town. I knew the way, I remembered. I kept going back. I kept going back. I kept going back. I kept going back. It was this place I would go, I would sit, I would walk through the woods, I would go back in the cabin, I would just look, and I never knew why I was doing it. And I never
Mm-hmm.
stopped to ask, why are you doing this? Because people with PTSD don't go back to the place where the bad thing happened. They
Yeah.
avoid that,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's not what I was doing. I
Right.
was trying to get those memories back. I was going back there because I needed my dad, and that was where I would find him, right?
Oh,
That was
yeah.
this safe, sacred place where I had my dad.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Again, I'm going to pause because I'm throwing a lot of information out here. Any clarification, anything that I can provide commentary on, anything like that?
Yeah, I'm just curious, just something I've thought of before that I'm just curious on this topic. You were talking about reunification therapy,
Hmm.
but while you're still at your mother's with these, same behaviors, the
Yeah.
survival mode, how do you feel reunification is, or how did that experience feel while you're still in that same situation, though? It's not like you had space from
Yeah.
that.
Well, in my opinion, that's why it didn't work.
Okay.
Um, because I was still in this really toxic environment. And again, the other problem is that money talks,
Hmm.
and my mother had access to a lot of money that my father did not have access to. And I went back and I looked at old court records from when all of this was going on. My mom had a team of 3 lawyers working for her on this. And
Yeah.
so, and my father was acting, I think it's pro se.
Okay. Yeah.
He was doing that. And so these lawyers, just anything that this counselor would say or anything that my dad would say, they would shred it.
Yeah.
And I think that what was going on there is they were trying to stall this out long enough until I turned 18. I think that's what they
Okay.
were trying to do, because they thought that if we can get it to the point where Kevin is 18, he's going to reject his dad. That's what's going to
Hmm.
happen here.
Yeah.
Um, and that's not really what happened.
Right.
There was definitely a wall there. I had an emotional disconnect to him, no doubt. I avoided him. There was avoidance there with my dad, not because he abused me, but it was the shame, the guilt from feeling like I had turned on him,
Okay.
that kind of thing. It's a weird thing to try to describe, but
Yeah.
it's like the child is in a delusional state, but there is a part of them that deep, 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 deep down inside knows that this is all not true.
Right.
But you just repress it and repress it and repress it and repress it
Yeah.
because you got to survive somehow,
Hmm.
and that's what I did. And you don't know that's what you're doing. You don't have a
Yeah.
framework for understanding this. You just know I'm doing some weird stuff, and I don't know
Yeah.
why. The reunification therapy really, again, I'm not an expert, but if there's if there's this kind of alienation going on, I do agree with Dr. Childress on this. Dr. Childress says this becomes a child protection issue. This child is in a codependent delusion with a narcissistic borderline parent. This is very serious pathology. This
Yeah.
puts the child at risk. There needs to be child protection intervention happening here. And I
Hmm.
agree with that. Whatever that looks like, that's really what should have happened.
Yeah.
And just the unfortunate thing is back then it was in the family court system where money and lawyers do all the talking.
Yeah.
And even this counselor, he used the term. I went and found him like years and years and years later when I was going through my recovery and was trying to put the pieces together. I found him just on Google and I called him up and I said, you may not remember me, but this is the year, this is when this happened. And he said, Kevin, unfortunately, I don't remember that specific case, but it's because I had 1,000 more just like it. And he said,
Wow.
and he was actually the one who first used the term parental alienation. He said, I had said brainwashing, and he said, no, 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 no. I wouldn't have told the court that you were brainwashed. I would have said that you were alienated. And
Okay.
that was when I first heard the term, and that gave me a framework for understanding what had actually happened to me. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And from that, is that when you were able to kind of gain more knowledge on that topic and look more into that and
Yeah,
realize more
so
things?
so the recovery in and of itself is a story and a half. So I'll get
Yeah.
to that now if you'd like me to, because that's a
Yeah.
question that I get a lot. I had all of these lost memories, all of
Right.
this repressed trauma. How in the world did you figure this out? And
Right.
that is why I say this last year has been the most significant year of my life by far. Now, in spite of all of these challenges that I went through in childhood, and in spite of all of this that I was forced to endure, I grew up.
Hmm.
And eventually I decided that I wanted to go into ministry. I became a pastor because I wanted to help people.
Yeah.
And I went to a seminary in St. Louis. I got my master's in divinity. I married a wonderful, wonderful woman who has just been a rock through all of this. We've been married for 10 years. We have three amazing kids. And in spite of all of the challenges that I had kind of been through, I sort of felt like I had done well for myself.
Yeah.
And eventually I was offered a job pastoring a good sized church and school in Maryland where I live now. But there was something that was happening. And what was going on is, seminary keeps you really, really busy, and work keeps you really busy, kids keep you really busy.
Hmm.
But anytime that I didn't have something to distract me or keep me busy, anytime that I had to sit with myself, these feelings would come up. And I
Okay.
didn't really know what they were, but it was like, I would get really anxious. I would feel like I had to go somewhere. I had to
Hmm.
go and do something that was something that I had left undone. I would get really, really sad for no reason. I would have this real sense of like loss, like I had lost something. I didn't know what it was. It was almost like depression type symptoms.
Yeah.
Some weekends I would get really, really angry, and I would it especially was bad anytime I would have a day off. That was when it was really, really bad. I would
Hmm.
get really, really short with my wife, with the kids. And eventually what happened was this, and this is the part of the story that I think it's a miracle. That's what I call it. I had had a really bad weekend, and I broke down and I just started crying in front of my wife. Like I had just been a tyrant the whole weekend. I was freaking out over the littlest things. I was losing my temper with the kids, with my wife. I wasn't happy about anything. I wasn't happy with anyone, and all of a sudden I just kind of broke down and I just started crying. And my wife embraced me. She held me, and I looked at her and I said, I don't know what's wrong with me, but I need to see somebody. And she said, okay, all right, I'll find you somebody. And it was like an hour later, she calls me up and she said, how do you feel about talking to a Jewish rabbi? And I said, that's interesting. I've never met any rabbis.
Yeah.
I kind of like that idea. That might actually work. And it sounds like the setup to a bad joke, right? Like the Christian pastor goes to a Jewish rabbi for therapy,
Right.
and then
Right.
they go out and have a beer afterwards, but
Yeah.
that's so that was how I met my rabbi, my therapist. And I went in for our first session. This is our first session, the very first one. And I thought that all of this was linked to like work related stress, that like it was the stress of ministry, and it was visiting hospice patients or listening to people's problems, that was wearing on me, that it was the staff dynamics and church politics and all that stuff. Like, that's what's causing this. Like, that's what I thought. And I just need to
Mhm.
figure out how to manage this better. That's honestly what I thought. And so I go in for my first session, and there's this kind rabbi in front of me, and he said, Kevin, tell me why you're here. And I started talking, and I was talking about the stress of ministry, and I was talking about this, and I was talking about that. And he just kind of let me talk for a solid half hour. And then he puts his hand up and he goes, Kevin, stop. I know what's wrong with you. Would you like to know? And I looked at him and I was like, you've known me for a half hour.
Right.
How do you know what's wrong? And he said, no, 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 no. I know what's wrong with you. And he said something to me, and I'll never forget this. I'll remember it as long as I live. He said, Kevin, what you have to understand is that you have a soul, and that soul was given to you by God. It never ends, it's eternal. But inside of that soul is every single person that you have ever been and every single person that you will ever be. And at a certain point in your life, there was a kid that felt isolated and alone and scared and hurt. And that child is still crying inside of you. You need to go find that kid, and you need to allow him to say the things that he has never been allowed to say. Until you do that, your soul is going to bleed. And that's what you're experiencing right now. You have a rupture in your soul. And I'm listening to this, and my first reaction was, that sounds like a load of shit. Like, that was my first reaction. I was like, I almost walked out. I was like, this sounds like the stupidest thing. This sounds like new age gook. This sounds like the stupidest thing. But he actually like sits me down and he goes, no, 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 no. Like, you're paying me and I still have you for another 20 minutes. I want you to try this. And he lays me down on his couch and he just had me do some breathing to kind of settle me down. And then he had me pick a specific memory. He said, I want you to find this memory, a memory when you first started to feel the way you're feeling now, this frantic, anxious, hurry up to get nowhere, scared, like you lost something. I picked a really specific memory, and it was when I was 12 years old. 12 years old. And I started to visualize it. And then all of a sudden, I started to feel something. And it was really weird. It was like, okay, I don't really know what I'm feeling here, but I think you might be onto something, because like there's something happening here and I don't really know what it is. I don't really know how to describe it, but I'm feeling something. And he says, okay, we're going to stop, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to wait like 3 or 4 days, and I want you to try this again. But this time, I want you to make sure that you're in a safe place. And I want you to make sure that you're around people that you trust, because sometimes when we have things locked away in the unconscious, when it comes to the surface, it can be kind of messy. And I said, okay. And he said, one more thing. This time when you repeat this exercise, try to see if you can get that kid to talk to you. And I said, so like the adult version of me is going to go talk to the 12-year old version of me and have a conversation. He said, yeah, that's exactly right. And I was like, okay, like I'll give it a shot. What can it hurt? And so I go home and I did exactly what he said. I waited 3 or 4 days, and then it was one night. The kids had gone to bed. Everything was kind of calm, and I said, "Okay, honey, I'm going to go into the bedroom and I'm going to try this, and I don't know what's going to happen, but we'll see what happens." And so I went in. I did the breathing like he had shown me, and I remember this pretty clearly. I could see this kid in my head, and I visualized myself as a man going to this 12-year-old, and I just sat down next to him where he was. And, he kind of had his head down. He was very sullen, very isolated. And I said, look, I don't know what you have to say, but whatever you need to say, you say it to me, because I'm going to keep you safe. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to punish you. I'm not going to hurt you. You don't have to be embarrassed for anything that you need to say. You say it to me because I am safe. And I swear this is true. This is what happened. In my head, it was almost like I didn't have control over it. This kid, this 12-year-old kid, reaches up and kind of grabs me by the head and tilts my head here. And then he whispers into my ear so quietly, I almost couldn't hear it, but he whispers into my ear, I miss my dad. And when that happened, it was like a dam broke. That's the only way I can describe it. It was like all of a sudden, all at once, all of these memories that I had lost were downloaded into my brain. I had all of them at once and I could see clearly. And it was like my wife later on, it was like I had been shot. Like this sound came out of me like a wounded animal. I have never made a sound like this in my life. And I was howling. I was crying so hard. And my wife comes running in there and she like grabbed me. I was shaking. I couldn't talk. My face was just really grimaced. I was gritting my teeth so hard that like I thought my jaw was gonna break. I was crying and crying and crying. And this went on for probably like 45 minutes. I could not talk. And my wife had no idea what had just happened. She's just holding me. And finally, when I could talk, I looked up at her and I said, honey, I've got some things to tell you that I have never told a soul. And I proceeded to tell her the story that I've shared with you today. And that's how I got my memories back. And at
Wow.
this point, my father and I had not spoken in probably 12 years, I think. And even when we were connected, it was very like, it's like I said, it was like there was a wall between us. I avoided him. I only called him when I absolutely had to. And, after 2 or 3 days of kind of processing what had happened, I said, I got to call my dad. And I picked up the phone and called him. And it was just incredible. It was like,
Mm.
Kevin, and I
Yeah.
said, Dad, I know you're excited to talk to me, but like, I really need to share with you some things that I have just now realized. So I really just kind of need you to listen to me.
Yeah.
And I explained to him what I had found out. And at this point, I didn't even know that it was called parental alienation. All I knew was that my mom had lied to me about a lot of things, and it
Mhm.
had radically altered the nature of my relationship with my dad, and I had lost him as a result of that.
Yeah.
And he was amazing. I mean, he was crying, and he said, Kevin, you've never been far from me. Don't you ever forget that. I love you and you have
Mhm.
never been far from me. And he was amazing. He said, don't hate your mom. She didn't know what she was doing. I forgave her a long time ago. And he didn't know everything, but he kind of
Yeah.
knew that this was going on. He didn't know
Yeah.
how bad it was on the home front. Like he didn't know how bad that had actually been. But it was incredible. And pretty shortly after that, I jumped on a plane in the middle of a blizzard. I was like, I am going to Kansas City and I'm
Oh.
going to see my dad. And everybody was telling me, like, no, 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 don't go. Like, it's dangerous, And I'm like, nope, nope. I mean, come hell or high water, I'm going to go see my dad. And I jumped on
Oh.
a plane in the middle of a blizzard. I went down, I saw him. He was 81 years old. And I ran up to him. I embraced him. I grabbed him by the face and I was just kissing him all over the place. And I was
Oh.
like, Dad, like, I love you so much and like I'm so sorry. And he was like, Kevin,
Wow.
you let that stuff go. One of the most healing things he said to me was, you know you didn't do this to me, we did this to you. It was not your job when you were 10 years old to know these deep complexities of right and wrong. It was our job as parents to keep you safe, and we failed. And it was interesting that he used that we language. He kind of was taking ownership for some of it, even though in the context of things, he didn't really do anything wrong. He was
Right.
kind of owning up to, like, I wanted to keep you safe. I didn't know how. Maybe there were things I should have done better to try to fight this a little more. He was kind of owning up to that, but he was completely absolving me of any responsibility for this whatsoever. And
Yeah.
so I spent some time in Kansas City. I spent a couple days with him, and then it was so funny because there were like 10 inches of snow on the ground. And I have a cousin, Ron, who lives in Kansas City. He's actually more like a big brother to me. And I said, I'm here. We have to go back to the land. We have to go there. And he's like, Kevin, it's 10 inches of snow. We're never getting in there. And I said, yes, we are. And so he's like, all right, if you are bound and determined to do this, like, let me at least get a really good truck. So like he owns a painting like house building company, and so he has access to these really huge trucks. So we got in this big monster truck with like snow tires and went all the way down to Columbia from Kansas City. And this land sits like on top of this huge hill. So I didn't even know if we were going to make it. We made it all the way up
Yeah.
the hill, and I go running in there. And the
Mhm.
cabin was still there. Like it was like falling apart because nobody had been there in years, but it was still there. And I got inside, and I had to like climb the wall to get in because the steps had
Wow.
fallen out. But this is the coolest part. I got to like the top level of this cabin, and there were all these pictures all over the wall of me and my dad. It was like something
Oh,
out of like a movie or something. And I'm
wow.
looking at this. There were pictures of me when I was 2 years old up on my dad's shoulder. There were pictures of him hugging me, and I just lost it. I mean,
Oh,
it was
yeah.
almost a moment where it was like it was too big for me. I was crying. I was thanking God for the experience. I was overwhelmed, and
Yeah.
it was amazing. And since that first trip, my family and I have made two more trips back to Kansas City so that my dad can meet his grandkids because
Oh,
I alienated my dad from his grandkids without knowing that that's what I was doing because
right.
I just told them, daddy, daddy's daddy wasn't a good daddy, so we don't talk to him. And
Yeah.
my oldest son, he's 7 now. With him, I was a little worried because I was like, how in the world do I communicate this to him? But it
Yeah.
actually really wasn't that hard. I took him aside one day and I said, do you know how sometimes, do you want to hear about daddy's daddy? And he was like, well, I thought your daddy's daddy I thought he was a bad guy. And I said, well, you know how sometimes somebody can be confused? Have you ever been confused about something? And he was like, "Oh yeah." I was like, when you can't find your shoes in the morning, you're confused, you can't really remember where you put them. He's like, "Yeah, I know what that feels like." And I said, "Well, Daddy was confused, and that's
Yeah.
not like the whole story. Do you really want to hear about? Can I tell you some stories about my dad?" And he was like, "Oh
Oh,
yeah, I like hearing stories about you, Daddy." And I was like, "Okay, well let me." And I told him stories about being down at the land and going fishing with my dad and him climbing trees and all this other stuff. And it really didn't take that long actually. He was kind of like, "Oh okay, you were confused. Well, I want to talk to my granddad now." And I was like, "All right, I'll put him
oh,
on the phone with you." And I called him up and they had a conversation and like Bear just like lit up. He was like
oh,
laughing. My dad was like, telling him little jokes and he was like, yeah, grandpa's so silly, and it was like,
oh,
and then when I took him down there, like Bear just ran and threw his arms around him and embraced him and was climbing all over him. And it was just like the most natural thing in the world. So now,
yeah.
the curse is broken. Alienation
Oh,
did not win. I'm back
yeah.
with my dad. I'm in recovery now. I'm still in therapy, working through a lot of this stuff from the past. But,
Yeah.
I've been in therapy now almost a year and I feel like a different person. A
Wow.
lot of those symptoms of PTSD that I didn't even know that that's what was going on, those are radically, radically, radically reduced. And I'm working on trying to find ways to tell the story in a way that's healing for people. So, um,
Yeah.
that's my story.
That's an amazing story. It's amazing to hear just pivotal moments in your life that you can recall that lead up to the pivotal moment of realizing that you
Yeah.
miss your dad and just reaching out. And I love what he said to you, that he doesn't want you to feel any blame, any kind of shame, guilt. That's amazing for him to embrace you like that as well, and say those things to you, and both of you just reunited. I It's such a heartwarming story in the end to hear that, and all that you've been through, though, to see that you're here helping people. And I mean, not everyone does take the time to kind of hear their inner self of, I need help, or I need to figure
Yeah.
this out. And that's commendable. I mean, that's amazing that you were like, I need to do something about this. I
Yeah.
need to figure it out.
Well, and one of the things too, I mean, it was the reason I call it a miracle is because when I went to therapy, I had no idea that it was linked to this. I had no
Yeah.
idea. And I had been to other therapists before that had missed this.
Yeah.
And somehow this Jewish rabbi looked inside of me and saw what nobody else saw. And he figured this out after one session.
Yeah.
It was really incredible, and I still see him to this day. He's a very good friend. He's helped me a lot with a lot of things, working through just some of the when you start to heal from trauma, you have to unlearn beliefs that you've held in the past, and you have to reject those. You have to
Yeah.
unlearn the unhealthy coping maladaptive mechanisms that you adopted just to survive. You have
Yeah.
to kind of catch your brain up to now. And there are come to find out, when I first started to sort of engage with the parental alienation world, what I didn't realize is that my story is kind of a unique one because there are adult survivors who discover that they've been alienated from their parents, but the really sad reality is that a lot of them don't reconnect with the parent. They
Yeah.
discover it after the parent has died, or they never discover it. And
Yeah.
I actually was fortunate enough that I did. And for me, that's very, very, very sobering. I think about, the what ifs a lot. Like, what if
Yeah.
my dad had died and I had realized this 10 years later? I mean, I don't know if I could ever recover from something like that. That would be just absolutely
Tragic.
horrible. That would be tragic. That would be awful. And so in entering this space, I've sort of realized that there are some steps in the healing process that I've done that seem to work, that seem to help catch your brain back up. If you can go
Okay.
back to places where things happened and just stand there and smell and observe, that helps. Photographs are really, really helpful from the different time periods from when things happen.
Yeah.
Definitely reconnecting with my dad, bonding with my dad. That was very, very healing in and of itself. The journaling, I've done a lot of that. That's really helpful. And the memories don't all come back at once. It was kind of like I got this great big download, and
Yeah.
then the grief response had to kick back on. So I had to grieve that loss. That was brutal. I mean, there were months of just I had to do bereavement therapy for that. That was really hard. So there are definitely different stages to this that you
Yeah.
kind of have to allow yourself to go through. But the bonding with the parent, I mean, I think that that's critical. That's what the child wants to do, and they need to be allowed to do that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah, so
reunification is a happy thing to be reunited, but again, like you're saying, a lot comes with that. There's trauma, there's triggering responses or memories to try and, bring back and remember the truth to things. So there is a lot that goes in to reunification as well, not just straight happy yay, like
yeah,
you're saying, it's a lot to process and go through and work on healing. I am, I have one question, I guess,
sure.
if I can ask it.
Yes, please.
Where are you with your mother today then? Or how did you
Yep.
confront her that you
No, my mom.
reunited?
So my mom died
Oh,
about
okay.
almost 5 years ago. So by the time all
Okay.
of this had happened, my mother was dead. And so part of what I had to do was I had to humanize her. That's actually one of the steps to healing. Um, I was very angry with her at first,
Yeah.
and very bitter. I had a lot of rage. I had some very, very, very angry, ugly feelings towards her. But eventually, once I went through kind of the stages of grief and those kinds of things, I was able to look at her and I was able to say, wait a second, your mom was not an evil person. Your mom was mentally ill. That was her problem. She was living in a delusional state and she believed things about reality that were not true.
Mhm.
That was the problem. So you can forgive somebody like that. And I do have good memories with my mother. There were times that she acted like a mom towards me. There were We had our moments. She was not all bad. She had good characteristics to her. And so
Mm,
you have to just be a little more nuanced, I think, about this because I think one thing, the whole problem with parental alienation is that it forces a kid to reject a parent, and in rejecting a parent, they're rejecting a part of themselves. So
yeah.
if you discover all this, you could very quickly get yourself into trouble by rejecting the parent that alienated you. You don't want to do that either because then you are both of those parents. You are
Mm,
two sides to a whole. And so, you don't want to do that either. So for me, I had to go through these stages to get to a place of forgiveness. And
yeah.
now I'm looking at it, I love my mother. I feel bad for her. I pity her. I really wish that she would have gotten the help that she needed.
Yeah.
She had a lot of trauma related to being adopted. That was where all of this started, was when she found out that she was adopted. That was
Okay.
where her trauma started, and she was reliving that trauma through me.
Mm,
That fear of abandonment, that cycle of abandonment, that's what she was doing. I know that now, but
yeah.
in the 1950s when she was born, they didn't know anything about mental health. And so they just didn't have the resources to get her the help that she needed. And my
Yeah.
mother, come to find out, had a lifetime of mental illness. I mean, she was in a mental institution in 1978. I had no idea.
Wow.
She had been committed for having a full-blown psychotic break with reality. And I found that out, and I went and found documentation for that outlined what had happened, and I was
Oh,
like,
wow.
wow, I mean, poor girl. So and even seeing, like, my dad did not harbor any resentment against her. Like, she hurt him worse than anybody, and he was all forgiveness. Just,
Wow.
you can't hold on to a grudge, Kevin. You can't do that. It'll kill you. You can't do that.
Yeah.
I loved your mother. She was a good person. She was just sick. And so all right, I gotta, forgive her, and I have. So that's
Wow.
how I kind of feel about it now. But at the same time, and I feel bad saying this, but I would not have been able to work through this with her alive. I wouldn't. It would not have, unless she were healed and well.
Right.
I would not have been able to get to this point. So
That
I
makes
feel bad
sense.
saying that, but it's kind of true. So
It makes sense. It because of her mental illness, she
yeah,
probably would have created kind of walls or blocking you from
yes,
fully healing and even seeing more parts of her life and how she was the way she was. So that all this came to light without having anyone stopping you from finding it or
right,
going through this journey. So that makes
yeah.
sense.
I mean,
Um,
I think that what it was is that that inner child, that little kid inside of me was always there. They were just kind of waiting for, like, is it safe to come out yet? And with
yeah.
my mom gone, it's like it's safe to come out now. That's kind of how I view it. So
Yeah, I see. Well, I'm sorry to hear that she is gone. It's still painful.
yeah,
I'm I'm so grateful to hear such a you have a powerful story. So keep speaking out, keep sharing it. It teaches
absolutely,
a lot about the child's perspective, which we don't hear enough of, I think. And so I'm really grateful that you came on and shared that perspective with us
absolutely.
today.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
again, for any, just a word to anybody going through this, whether you're an adult survivor or a parent, there are resources out there. Learn about the dynamic,
Yeah.
learn about what's actually going on. For me, some of the things that were really helpful. Dr. Craig Childress has a couple lectures out there that I found very, very helpful.
Yeah.
Those are good. I've done a couple interviews with Maddie on the Anti-Alienation Project. She's got some
Hmm.
wonderful stuff that I think is very, very helpful. Testimonials from both parents and children. Read up on the thing. To anybody who says that parental alienation doesn't exist or that it's pseudoscience, I'm sorry, but you are just not up to date with the most recent research. You're just not. You're
Yeah.
not living. You're not up to date. I mean,
Yeah.
yes, there's been controversy over the term parental alienation, but the behaviors are well known. They're well documented. Family court systems and lawyers and counselors deal with this stuff all the time.
Yeah.
It is a very real phenomenon. It does happen. I don't
Yeah.
care what you call it. I don't care if you throw out the label and you call it parents lying to their kids to to destroy the relationship with the other parent, to weaponize them in a high conflict divorce. If you want to call it that, call it that. I don't care. But like the behaviors are there, and if you deny that, then you're denying the lived experience of literally thousands of people.
Right.
And it's painful. It causes huge problems. And so learn about the dynamic, or read up on it, learn about trauma, learn about attachment, all of those things. And I think that being informed and being aware, my hope is that pretty soon we'll see reform in all of the systems. I think there needs to be
Yeah.
total reform across the board in family courts and counseling and the way that we do this stuff. But I think we're waking up. I think every
Yeah.
generation has kind of that aha moment, and maybe this is ours. So,
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you just said. I completely agree, and I think it is really great to find resources, tools, other people who are speaking out or have resources to get knowledgeable and really read up on these subjects. And it's a very, very real issue that's
yes,
going on that we are really hoping more professionals, therapists, legal, court, everything has more background knowledge, more understanding to this, how it's a very real issue and what's happening in these family dynamics. And then, it creates long lasting impacts on children who are going through it. And we need something more to help that and
absolutely.
prevent that. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, thank you so much, Kevin, for being on here today.
You're
I
very
truly
welcome.
appreciate it. So,
Thanks for having on. I'm humbled.
yes,
Thank you for listening to You Can't Break Us. If this episode spoke to you, subscribe and leave a review. Every voice matters. Every story counts. If you or someone you know has a story to share, email youcan'tbreakuspodcast@gmail.com to connect with me. Until next time, stay strong, stay grounded, and never stop using your voice. Because no matter what they've tried to take from us,